I'm delighted to open the last panel of the day, our panel on emotional contagion of trauma. And I would like to start by inviting our first honored speaker, Professor Tsachi Ein-Dor. Professor Ein-Dor is an associate professor and a social psychologist in the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya. He finished his PhD in Bar-Ilan University, supervised by Professor Mario Mikolinzer. He then met Zehava during his graduate studies and worked with her for the past 15 years. Professor Ein-Dor studies post-traumatic stress disorder and secondary traumatization from the perspective of attachment theory and has specific views about the upside of insecure attachment. He published numerous papers. Today he is going to talk about the role of attachment styles in the dynamic processes of secondary traumatization. Professor Ein-Dor, the floor is yours, please.
So, hello, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. Zehava was and still is my mentor. It happens that Mario was the first statistician, and I replaced him. So I guess Zehava has an attachment with statistics. Statisticians as well. So we have worked for 15 years. I hope it was not traumatic, because as I would show today, it could be contagious. So I hope my kids do not have something to do with statistics phobia. Regarding trauma, we know quite a bit about trauma experience and how highly negative situation can impact not only our body but also our mind and soul. But the concept, the knowledge that trauma impacts our body and soul, it's not that new. The first to speak about that were the Greeks. So we can see stories like the Iliad about Achilles and the war against Troy, in which is not too much about the history of the war and why Troy fell, but is most about the mental processes that Achilles is going through because of the atrocities of war, because he withstand the death of comrades, family, and some say a lover. Because of that, he became enraged and caused the downfall of Troy. So the Greeks knew that war-related trauma caused something to the mental states. And later on, Jonathan Shai have written a book that creates an equivalence between what Achilles has gone through and what veterans of the Vietnam War had gone through. So the same kind of equivalence in the processes. Later on, the Romans, such as Macer and Ulpiano, wrote laws against punishing veterans of war, and 5 out of 6 reasons why not to punish are mental reasons, such as battle fatigue, which may be a combat stress reaction that we most known today. So this knowledge is not that new. The knowledge that trauma does not stop there, that it can be transmitted to others in the social surrounding of traumatized people, that's much newer. The first to speak about that, we can mention the work of Sarah Haley in the 70s. She worked and treated veterans of war of Vietnam, and she, in the therapy session, began suffering from secondary traumatization that is known today, only because she heard about what happened in Vietnam War. We can also mention the work of Yael Danieli in the 80s, the same kind of processes in therapy, but now with Holocaust survivors. So we began paying attention to the fact that only being related and in social connection to a traumatized person, we can become with the symptoms of trauma ourselves, a process that we call secondary traumatization. But because it's much newer to science, we only have limited knowledge about the dynamic processes Dynamic processes that begins by a traumatized person and ends with someone in his or her surrounding that becomes secondary traumatized. And something must happen in between. Something must happen in the social surrounding, in the social environment in between. So the traumatized person, in one way or another, transmitted the trauma into the social environment, and once there, the trauma is being transmitted to another person. And that dynamic we can think about in a social psychological way. So the traumatized person can transmit the trauma into the social environment in two main channels. One would be the verbal one. I can speak about what happened to me, and that's what happened usually in therapy. I disclose all my experiences, the bad experiences, the smells, the sounds, the sight, who I lost and what happened, and then now you are exposed secondhand to what happened. But I can also do it in a non-verbal way by my facial expression, body expression. I can behave a bit awkward than usual and so on, and then delivering the trauma in a non-verbal way. Now that it's there in the social surrounding, people can get infected by that. They can be just bystander, passive viewers of the situation, but they can also do something active. They can request more information, and we do that often. What happened to you? Tell me more. I would like to know exactly what caused your current behavior. And then I'm exposing myself to more trauma-related material. And I can also avoid that. I can tell him or her, well, that's too much information. I would like to know less. I can begin using my mobile phone and look at the screen and not at the person and so on. So there is a dynamic interaction between the traumatized person that ends with another person becomes secondary traumatized. And to show that this process is doable, let's get infected by a lemon. So think about a lemon, this lemon, and imagine that, slice it in your mind, smell it, and now take one half and bite onto it with all those juicy stuff inside. Now, if someone have a sensation at the sides of your mouth, now you have been infected by a lemon. And you did that only by me describing a lemon. You haven't tasted a lemon. So I would like to predict that the same kind of processes would happen in secondary traumatization. One person would describe what happened, and you, as that person, and you would become secondary traumatized because it creates physiological and psychological outcomes when only hearing that information. And today I would like to adopt one perspective that might explain this dynamic processes that happens, and the perspective of attachment that Mario talked about. And the reason for that, to choose attachment, is several. One, when Bowlby talked about attachment, he described a system that promotes survival from the cradle to the grave, and it's activated by threats and perception of danger. So by definition, when the trauma occurred, the attachment system was active. That's the definition of the system. It's also an emotion regulation system. It's supposed to decrease distress and get to balance of emotion following the threats and danger, and hence, by definition, it was active when processing the trauma. So attachment should be highly relevant to trauma, but it does not stop there. The way attachment achieves its goals is via social processes. I seek proximity with others, I get help from others, and the way I'm regulating my emotion, it's not self-regulation, it's regulating with other people, it's co-regulation. So I would like to suggest that attachment would be highly relevant to secondary traumatization because the way it operates in a social way. And the dynamics would be dependent on the specific attachment styles that people have. Secure attachment is a person who go, seek aid, disclose what happens, and then have very effective emotion regulation abilities. But that's only half of us. The second half are insecure. One insecurity, as Mario mentioned, is hyperactivating the system, attachment anxiety, and those people are highly sensitive to threats and have very poor emotion regulation abilities. So we can predict what would happen in the process of secondary traumatization that we would do in a bit. The third main style is attachment avoidance. Those people have quite shallow emotions, shallow reactivity, and distancing technique. They would like to stay as far as possible physically and emotionally. Now, attachment, as Mario mentioned, was related to PTSD, not to secondary traumatization so much, but to PTSD. And I think the very first was one of Mario's studies with Victor Florian and Aaron Veller in the first Gulf War. They administrated questionnaires just after 2 weeks after the war and found correlation between different attachment insecurities and more symptoms of PTSD. That was the first try. Many papers came after that. I think the best one, and Mario mentioned that as well, is the one with Mikol Linzer, Philip Shaver, and Neta Choresh, and it's the best one only because of the timing. Mario predicted the war, and he began administrating questionnaire a week before. And then when the war started, he had a unidirectional ability to predict PTSD, and that's amazing, and also all about timing. So Mario has a perfect timing. So he was able to show that attachment can unidirectionality association with PTSD. But the question is how that could be related to secondary traumatization, the process by which a traumatized person transmitted trauma-related material into the social environment and then other people takes that. So let's think first about the traumatized person. What would increase the likelihood that he or she would put trauma-related material into the social environment? If that person is high on attachment anxiety, we know that they have unrestrained self-disclosure, meaning they talk too much, too quickly, to anyone about anything. So they would, not only that you would know the entire history of the family of that person, you would know every detail about the trauma, hence you would be exposed to much more trauma-related material than usual. And that's only in the verbal channel. If we think about the nonverbal channel, they have high negative affectivity, meaning that they are all over the place with their reaction, very excessive, very intensive. So you can see that something very bad is happening. So both because of the verbal and nonverbal channels, we can predict a traumatized person high on attachment anxiety would transmit more, or he or she are more likely to transmit trauma-related material into the social environment. Attachment avoidance would be quite the opposite. Attachment avoidance have restricted self-disclosure. They do not talk too much or not at all, not to strangers, but also not to close others. So they would not speak about the trauma, and if the trauma is not spoken to the social environment, there is nothing to get infected by. But that's also true to the nonverbal channel, because they have reduced affect display. You just do not know what is happening to them. So because of both channels, less trauma-related material is inside the social environment. And attachment, people high in security or secure people would be somewhere in between. They have an appropriate self-disclosure. they know when and to whom to disclose, and they have a balanced affect display. If they are sad, you will know it, and you know that the intensity of it. They do not exaggerate the affect display. So if we need to predict the likelihood of transmitting trauma-related material to the social environment, we would predict that people who have an attachment anxiety would be more likely to transmit that, and people who have attachment avoidance would be less likely to put trauma-related material into the social environment. Now, once that it's there, what about the personality of the listener? How their attachment styles would affect the probability of getting infected by secondary traumatization. Now, if that person is high on attachment anxiety, one thing that we know, it comes with high intrusiveness. The need to know everything about a person. So I would nag. I would ask, well, how are you doing? Tell me more, tell me more, tell me more. And then you are exposed to much more trauma-related material than you would without asking. This is combined with high negative affectivity and very limited ability to regulate the emotions. And hence, there is a very bad cocktail of being engulfed with trauma and not knowing what to do with it. And that's not a good prognosis. Attachment avoidance would be quite the opposite. The opposite because at the basis of attention, they are inattentive to stress-related cue. They shift away from negative stimuli. So they do not pay attention to such stimuli. And they have active distancing strategies. They walk away, they stop talking, they switch topics, they begin, again, using this instead of listening. So they are doing many efforts just not to listen. And secure people would be in between. They would listen because they are secure. They would want to know what happens, but they have an effective emotion regulation and stress regulation abilities that would enable them to avoid developing secondary traumatization. So if we need to predict who would be more likely to take the trauma onto him or herself, we would predict that people who have attachment anxiety would be more likely to become secondary traumatized, but people who have attachment avoidance would be less likely to be traumatized. And that's because, again, they walk away, do not listen, and if you are not exposed, no secondary trauma. Now, we also thought about what could be the worst possible cocktail, the worst possible combination of an traumatized person and a person or listener in the social surrounding. And we thought that people who have attachment anxiety, if they would be traumatized, they would deliver much more trauma-related material into the social environment. And if this is combined with a listener who is anxious, he would request more information and would not know how to regulate that. So that's supposed to be the worst combination. That, of course, compared to a person who is secure in talking, because he or she would know how much and to whom to expose, and a person who is avoidant, who would not talk at all. So not talking, not exposing anyone. And we have done 2 studies to try to support this model. So in the first study, we called to 80 pairs of participants, pairs of good and close friends, not romantic pairs, into the lab, showed them to separate rooms, and then each one answer an attachment questionnaire that enable us to assess the extent of attachment security and insecurity, basically anxiety and avoidance. Then we administrated implicit and explicit affect measures. Explicit measures means that we asked directly at the affect state questions, and implicit is lexical decision task that enable to assess the accessibility of certain affects that the person is thinking about in the cognition. Then what we are doing is we are showing clips to each of the people. And there are two conditions. In the control condition, both members of the couple are viewing a neutral movie clip. But in the experiment condition, one of them is viewing a potential traumatic movie from a movie theater called The Stoning of Suraya M., in which people witness, it's quite a nasty film, people witness the death of a woman because of stoning of several men. It's not nice to view, but ethically because it's a movie theater. To make sure that participants are viewing that, we wanted them to count the number of stones being thrown onto that woman. And in the control condition, the movie clip was about stones of the Middle Ages, and we asked participants to count the number of times the word stone was spoken. So it's quite nasty clip. Following that, we show them to a room that they need to wait, and they actually need to wait for the second phase of the study, so we do not do anything aside from seeing what they are doing, what they are talking about. Specifically, we're looking at the amount of trauma-related material that's being transmitted in verbally and non-verbally by the traumatized person, or the potentially traumatized person, the one who saw the difficult movie. And we are also seeing what the listener is doing. Does he do nothing? Does he request more information? Or does he avoid the information? Once we code this, we administrate once again the implicit and explicit affect measures to see the change from baseline following the interaction. So in the first study, what we're looking at is the first minutes of secondary traumatization. It's not secondary traumatization per se, because the psychiatric definition comes 2 days after the event. So study 1 is only about the first minutes of potential secondary traumatization processes that happens. And let's see the results. So first about the person, the potentially traumatized person who saw the movie, the potentially traumatized movie. What could predict the increase in negative affect that he or she would stand? So first, it is related to his own personality. If that person is high on attachment anxiety, you can predict that they would be more distressed or more higher negative affectivity, but that was regardless of condition. When you are anxious, probably you are anxious. So we see an increase regardless of what we did. What predicted specifically the increase that relates to trauma is the listener attachment orientations. If the listener was high on attachment anxiety, we see a bigger increase in negative affectivity. So if I saw a movie and then I'm speaking to an anxious person, the reaction of that anxious person, which is, oh my God, what just happened, kind of codes inside me that something bad actually happened, and then I see a big increase in negative affectivity. The opposite happens with avoidance when we see the least increase. Avoidance reaction is kind of indifference. Like that. Okay, so? And if this is the reaction, and you tell something bad, and the reaction is, okay, so? You might code it as not so bad. And we do not see a big increase in negative affectivity. And actually, what is done today in the Israeli Defense Force by the psychologist as first response is normalizing the situation. You just normalize the reaction. It's not that bad. It's normal what you are feeling, and that is doing exactly as the avoidant people are doing. Well, that's nothing new. But we came to speak about secondary traumatization. So what happens there? What can predict the increase in negative affectivity for the person who did not view the clip? And that also relates to his own personality, the listener attachment orientation. So if the person who listens is an avoidant person, we see the least secondary traumatization, the least increase in negative affectivity. That's because they avoid. We see an avoidance reaction. We see them beginning to, again, use the mobile phone, shifting topics, do not answer questions, do not cooperate in the discussion, and they have the least increase in negative affectivity. We predicted that the highest increase would be that of an anxious person, and we do find it, but in combination with the traumatized person attachment styles as well. And we predicted that two anxious people would be the worst, the combination with an anxious listener and an anxious traumatized person. But that is not what we found. We found that the worst combination is when an anxious is listening to a secure person who talks about trauma. And that is the highest increase in negative affectivity and secondary traumatization. And that's kind of surprised us, but it made sense when we thought about it. If you are talking, you are anxious, and you are talking to another anxious friend, you already know that person. You know that he's anxious. You know that he exaggerates everything. So now we just talk about something very traumatic, but it's not uncommon. So it does not affect you. It's him. But when your friend is secure, and is usually a rock and stable, but he falls, he begins talking about trauma, and I'm anxious, he's secure, and he talks about trauma, it must be very harsh. And hence, then you begin developing secondary traumatization. If your best friend, your rock, falls, you falls after him or her. In the second study, what we did, and I cannot show you the results because it's still ongoing, but what we have done is replicated this study, but now added 48 hours later a questionnaire about acute stress disorder to see if we can get to a psychiatric definition of secondary traumatization. Now, we do not expect to receive any clinical threshold, God forbid. Otherwise, we have an ethical issues with the study. But what we are expecting is a very small shift in the intensity of acute stress disorder symptoms that would be equivalent to what we are finding in the first study. And we have 30 couples out of the needed 80. And there be light. Okay, that's God signing that I need to finish. So, just a final comment. What I wanted to show is that we need to take the dynamics between people into the consideration when talking about trauma and the possibility to inflict trauma on others, and specifically look into attachment theory because it could be a big predictor of these dynamic processes. So with this note, I would like to say thank you.